The grandfather clock in the entrance hall of Whitmore Hall had been striking the quarter hour when the scream shattered the genteel tranquillity of the October afternoon. It was a sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of respectability that shrouded the ancient Yorkshire manor, a cry of such genuine terror that it brought every soul in the house running toward the locked library, where Vivian Ashcroft, the celebrated art dealer and master of Whitmore Hall, lay dead upon his Persian carpet. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper whose composure had weathered 30 years of domestic crises, stood trembling in the doorway with the key still clutched in her arthritic fingers. Behind her gathered the small assembly of weekend guests who had come to witness what Ashcroft had promised would be the most significant art acquisition of the century. A recently discovered Caravaggio that had sent ripples of excitement through London's most exclusive collecting circles. The door was locked from the inside. Mrs. Hartwell managed to whisper, her voice barely audible above the shocked murmurs of the assembled company. "I had to use the master key. He never locked himself in during the day. Never." Dr. Geoffrey Pemberton, a distinguished physician and long-time friend of the deceased, pushed gently past the others and knelt beside the body. Ashcroft lay face down near his mahogany desk, his silver hair matted with blood from a grievous wound to the back of his skull. The murder weapon, a heavy bronze statuette of Apollo that had adorned the mantelpiece, lay discarded nearby, its base dark with evidence of its deadly purpose. But it was not merely the presence of death that sent a collective shiver through the gathering. The ornate gilt frame that had held the Caravaggio, Judith beheading Holofernes, a masterpiece worth more than most men could earn in several lifetimes, now hung empty upon the wall, its precious contents vanished as completely as if they had never existed. "Impossible," breathed Lady Constance Fairfax, the elderly dowager whose own collection rivaled that of the British Museum. "The windows are barred, and we were all together in the drawing-room when we heard—" She could not finish the sentence. Indeed, the library's tall windows bore iron grille-work installed decades earlier for security, and each was latched firmly from within. The chimney was far too narrow for human passage, and the single door through which they had entered remained the only apparent means of access. Yet somehow, in the space of mere minutes, a killer had struck with savage efficiency and escaped with one of the art world's most coveted treasures. Young Timothy Ashcroft, the victim's nephew and heir, stood pale and shaking near the doorway. "Uncle Vivian was so excited about today," he said, his voice hollow with shock. "He said the Caravaggio would establish Whitmore Hall as one of England's premier private galleries. He'd been planning this, unveiling for months." "Planning," murmured a precise, accented voice from the entrance hall, "is indeed the foundation of all human endeavor, both noble and ignoble." The assembled guests turned as one toward the speaker, a small, dapper gentleman with an egg-shaped head and magnificent moustaches, who stood surveying the scene with eyes that missed nothing. Hercule Poirot had arrived at Whitmore Hall, not as an invited guest, but as fate's own response to the cry for justice that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the ancient manor. "Monsieur Poirot!" Dr. Pemberton rose from beside the body, relief evident in his voice. "Thank heaven you're here. I telephoned you the moment we discovered this." Poirot stepped carefully into the library, his keen gaze taking in every detail with the methodical precision of a master craftsman examining his tools. He noted the position of the body, the angle of the fallen statuette, the empty picture frame, and, most particularly, the faces of those who watched him, for Hercule Poirot knew that, in the immediate aftermath of murder, truth and deception waged their most revealing battle in the human countenance. "Mes amis," he said softly, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "we find ourselves confronted with what appears to be an impossible crime. A locked room, a vanished masterpiece, and a man who has paid the ultimate price for his passion for beauty." His eyes moved slowly from face to face, cataloguing each expression, each nervous gesture, each telltale sign of guilt or innocence. "But Poirot, he tells you this," There are no impossible crimes, only insufficient understanding of human nature. Someone in this room, or someone who was in this room, has committed murder most foul. And before this day is done, the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot will have unraveled every thread of deception, every carefully constructed alibi, every secret motive that has led to this moment of violence. The trap was set, the players assembled, and the greatest detective in England had arrived to conduct the deadly symphony of truth that would expose a killer's heart. The drawing-room of Whitmore Hall had been transformed under Hercule Poirot's exacting supervision into something resembling a courtroom, though one presided over by aesthetics rather than mere jurisprudence. With characteristic precision, the Belgian detective had arranged the chairs in a perfect semicircle, each positioned at precisely the same distance from the ornate Persian carpet that served as his stage. He paused to adjust a crystal paperweight on the side table, aligning it with the geometric pattern of the wallpaper, before turning his attention to the assembled company. The local constabulary had arrived with commendable efficiency, led by Inspector Hartwell, a solid Yorkshire man whose practical approach to crime detection had served the county well for 20 years. Yet even Inspector Hartwell recognized that the complexities of this particular case demanded a more refined touch, and he had gratefully deferred to Poirot's expertise while maintaining the necessary official protocols. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "we find ourselves in circumstances most extraordinary. A man lies dead, a masterpiece has vanished, and somewhere among us sits one who has committed the gravest of sins against both life and art." His keen eyes moved methodically across each face, cataloguing expressions, noting the subtle tells that betrayed inner turmoil. Lady Constance Fairfax occupied the chair nearest the fireplace, her aristocratic bearing intact despite the tremor in her gloved hands that she could not quite suppress. At 73, she possessed the kind of steely dignity forged in an era when the British Empire spanned the globe. Yet Poirot observed how her gaze studiously avoided the direction of the library where death had made its violent entrance. "Lady Fairfax," Poirot said gently, "your relationship with Monsieur Ashcroft, it was, how shall we say, professionally competitive." "Indeed," she replied, her voice carrying the crisp authority of generations of breeding. "Vivian and I have been rivals in the art world for over 30 years. We disagreed on methodology, on ethics, and most particularly on the wisdom of acquiring works of questionable provenance." Her fingers worried at the clasp of her handbag, a nervous gesture that suggested deeper currents beneath her composed exterior. "However, Monsieur Poirot, I would never have wished him harm. Despite our differences, he possessed a genuine passion for beauty, even if his methods were sometimes unscrupulous." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, filing away both her words and the subtle implications they carried. Lady Fairfax's own collection rivaled Ashcroft's in prestige, and their public disputes over certain acquisitions had been the subject of considerable gossip in London's art circles. Dr. Geoffrey Pemberton sat with the professional composure of one accustomed to death, yet his medical eye betrayed a deep personal sorrow that spoke to decades of friendship. His silver hair was immaculately groomed, his movements precise and economical, the habits of a man who had spent his life making decisions upon which other lives depended. "Doctor," Poirot continued, "you have known the deceased for many years, n'est-ce pas?" "Since Cambridge," Pemberton replied, his voice steady despite the emotion that flickered in his eyes. "Vivian was like a brother to me. We met when he was reading art history and I was studying medicine. He never married, you know. Said his collection was family enough for any man." The doctor paused, seeming to gather himself. "I was here today both as his friend and as his physician. Vivian had a tendency toward high blood pressure during moments of excitement, and today's unveiling, well, he had been anticipating it for months. Timothy Ashcroft, the victim's nephew and now sole heir, presented a study in barely controlled anxiety. At 28, he possessed the kind of weak handsomeness that suggested a life of privilege without corresponding purpose. His inheritance of Whitmore Hall and his uncle's considerable fortune had just transformed from distant expectation to immediate reality, a fact that was not lost on anyone present. "Monsieur Timothy," Poirot said, his tone gentle yet penetrating. "Your uncle, he was in good health for a man of his years?" "Oh yes, quite robust," Timothy replied, the words tumbling out with nervous energy. "He often boasted that he would live to 90, like his grandfather. The Ashcroft men have excellent longevity." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, a gesture that spoke to inner turmoil. "Uncle Vivian raised me after my father died. He was demanding, certainly, but he provided for me generously." Yet Poirot noted what Timothy did not say, that his uncle's generosity had come with strings attached, that the young man's gambling debts and failed business ventures had been a source of considerable tension between them. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, stood near the doorway like a faithful sentinel whose world had been turned upside down. Her weathered face bore the marks of 3 decades of loyal service, and her distress at her employer's death was evident in every line of her careworn features. "Mrs. Hartwell," Poirot said kindly, "you have served this house faithfully for many years. Tell me, what was Monsieur Ashcroft's routine today?" "He was up early, sir, more excited than I'd seen him in years," she replied, her voice steady despite her obvious distress. "He spent the morning in the library, making final preparations for the unveiling. He insisted that only essential staff be present today, myself, cook, and young Elsie for the tea service. He was most particular about security, you understand." "And the keys to the library?" "I have the master key, sir, as I've had for 20 years. Mr. Ashcroft had his own key, naturally, but he rarely locked the door during daylight hours. That's what made it so strange, finding it latched when I went to serve tea." Poirot absorbed this information with the methodical precision of a master craftsman examining his tools. Each person in this room represented a thread in the complex tapestry of relationships, rivalries, and hidden motivations that had culminated in murder. Lady Fairfax's professional jealousy and possible financial difficulties, Dr. Pemberton's intimate knowledge of his friend's habits and health, Timothy's inheritance and mounting debts, Mrs. Hartwell's access and loyalty. Each relationship carried within it the potential seeds of violence. "Mes amis," Poirot said finally, his voice carrying a note of finality, "we have established the dramatis personae of our little tragedy. Each of you had reason to be here today. Each possessed knowledge of Monsieur Ashcroft's plans, and each, whether through opportunity, access, or intimate familiarity with this house, possessed the means to commit murder." He paused, allowing his words to settle like dust in still air. "But Poirot, he knows that means and opportunity are not enough. What we seek now is the truth that lies hidden beneath the surface of respectability, the motive that drove one among you to take a life and steal a masterpiece." Inspector Hartwell cleared his throat. "Mr. Poirot, with your permission, I'd like to begin taking formal statements." "Mais certainement, Inspector," Poirot replied with a slight bow. "But first, we shall hear from each person exactly where they were at the moment of crisis. For in a locked-room mystery, the question is not merely who had the will to kill, but who possessed the knowledge and opportunity to create an impossible crime." The trap was set, the players revealed, and the deadly game of truth and deception was about to begin, in earnest. Hercule Poirot stood before the assembled company with the bearing of a conductor preparing to orchestrate a symphony of revelation. His immaculate appearance, from his perfectly waxed moustaches to his patent leather shoes that gleamed despite the autumn mud of Yorkshire, spoke to a mind that demanded order in all things. He withdrew a small leather notebook from his waistcoat pocket and opened it with the reverence of a priest handling sacred texts. the establishment of facts. Before we proceed with the complexities of human motivation, Poirot announced, his accented English carrying absolute authority, we must first establish the foundation upon which all truth rests, the precise sequence of events. Inspector Hartwell, the medical examiner's preliminary assessment. Inspector Hartwell consulted his notes with methodical care. Dr. Morrison estimates death occurred between 2:15 and 2:30 this afternoon. The wound was inflicted by a single blow from the bronze statuette, delivered with considerable force to the base of the skull. Précisément, and the scream that brought everyone running. This occurred at what time? 2:37. Dr. Pemberton interjected with medical precision. I checked my pocket watch immediately upon hearing Mrs. Hartwell's cry. It's a habit from my medical practice. Timing is often crucial in matters of life and death. Poirot made precise notations, his pen moving with mechanical accuracy. Excellent. So we have established that between 2:15 and 2:30, our victim met his fate, and at 2:37, the crime was discovered. Now, mes amis, we shall reconstruct these crucial 22 minutes with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. Lady Fairfax's account. Poirot turned his penetrating gaze upon Lady Constance, his manner suggesting he could peer directly into her soul. Lady Fairfax, your movements during this critical period? Lady Constance adjusted her pearl necklace with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly. I was in the drawing-room following luncheon, which concluded at 1:30. Vivian excused himself to make final preparations for the afternoon's unveiling. The rest of us remained together, discussing the significance of the Caravaggio discovery. And you remained continuously in the drawing-room. A slight hesitation, almost imperceptible to anyone but Poirot. I stepped onto the terrace briefly, perhaps at 2:20, to take some air. The excitement of the day had given me a slight headache. I was gone no more than 5 minutes. Poirot noted how her gaze flickered toward the window as she spoke. The terrace, it offers a view of the library windows? No, monsieur. The library faces the east garden. The terrace overlooks the south lawns entirely. Dr. Pemberton's testimony. Dr. Pemberton, your recollection of events? The physician straightened, his medical training evident in his precise recall. I remained in the drawing-room throughout, engaging in conversation with Timothy about his uncle's collecting philosophy. We discussed the ethical implications of acquiring works with uncertain provenance, a topic that had long been a point of contention between Vivian and Lady Fairfax. You did not leave the drawing-room at any point? Only briefly, at 2:10, to wash my hands in the cloakroom, the lavatory tapsticks. One must turn it quite firmly. I returned within 5 minutes and remained until we heard Mrs. Hartwell scream. Timothy's nervous recollection. Poirot's attention shifted to the young heir, whose nervous energy was palpable. Monsieur Timothy, your account? Timothy's face flushed as he shifted uncomfortably. As Dr. Pemberton said, we were in conversation in the drawing-room. I'd hoped to speak privately with Uncle Vivian before the unveiling, but he seemed so focused on his preparations. There were certain financial matters I needed to discuss with him. Financial matters? Poirot's tone remained neutral, yet the question carried weight. I had some debts that required attention. Uncle Vivian had been less than sympathetic to my recent difficulties. I thought perhaps the success of today's acquisition might put him in a more generous mood. And you remained in the drawing-room continuously? Yes, except for a brief moment when the telephone rang in the entrance hall. It was my man in London. I told him I would call back. I was away less than a minute, just after 2:00. Mrs. Hartwell's discovery. Poirot turned to the housekeeper with characteristic courtesy. Mrs. Hartwell, you discovered our tragedy, your movements during this period. I was preparing the tea service in the kitchen, sir, as was my custom. At precisely 2:30, I brought the tray to the library to serve Mr. Ashcroft. I found the door locked, most unusual for daytime, and used my master key. That's when Her voice faltered. In your 30 years of service, had Monsieur Ashcroft ever locked himself in the library during daylight hours? Never, sir. He was most particular about accessibility. He often said that art should never be imprisoned, even by locked doors. The physical evidence. Now, mes amis, we shall examine what the room itself tells us. Poirot led them back to the library, his keen eyes noting details others had missed. He paused by the empty gilt frame, studying the brass tacks arranged with mathematical precision in a china saucer. "These tacks," he murmured, "they are arranged by size. Not the work of a hurried thief, n'est-ce pas?" He moved to the fireplace, where embers still glowed despite the mild October day. Among the ashes, charred threads curled like blackened vines. The coal scuttle sat full to the brim beside an unused poker. Curious, Poirot observed. A fire on such a temperate day, yet the coal remains untouched, the poker unused. Someone burned something here. Something that required immediate destruction. The missing element, Inspector Hartwell cleared his throat. "Mr. Poirot, there's something else. We've been unable to locate Miss Margaret Vale, Mr. Ashcroft's secretary. She was expected today for the unveiling, but never arrived." Poirot's eyes brightened with interest. "Ah, the absent witness, often the most revealing of all. Tell me, what do we know of this Mademoiselle Vale?" Mrs. Hartwell spoke up. "She's been with Mr. Ashcroft for 3 years, sir. Handles all his correspondence, his appointments, his business dealings. Very efficient, very discreet. It's most unlike her to miss such an important occasion without word. And her usual routine. She arrives each morning at 9 sharp, leaves at 5, lives in a cottage in the village. Never missed a day in 3 years, sir." Poirot's preliminary observations. Poirot closed his notebook with a decisive snap, his eyes moving from suspect to suspect with the intensity of a master chess player. "So we have established our timeline, our alibis, our locked room. Yet certain inconsistencies emerge, small cracks through which truth may seep." He began to pace with measured steps. Lady Fairfax steps outside for air but cannot view the library. Dr. Pemberton washes his hands at precisely the moment when such an action might provide opportunity. Timothy awaits his uncle while harboring financial desperation. Mrs. Hartwell discovers a locked door that was never locked in daylight. Poirot paused before the empty frame. "And someone took great care to remove this painting properly. Note the careful arrangement of the mounting hardware. This was not the work of a panicked killer, but of someone with knowledge, with time, with purpose." He turned to face the assembled company. "Each of you has presented an alibi. Each had opportunity, perhaps motive. But only one among you possesses the key to our impossible crime. Not merely the physical key, but the knowledge of how to create the illusion of impossibility itself. The deepening mystery. The absent secretary troubles Poirot greatly," he continued, his voice carrying a note of concern. "In Christie's experience, when a key witness fails to appear at the crucial moment, it is rarely coincidence. Either Mademoiselle Vale has met with misfortune, or she possesses knowledge that someone wished to suppress." Inspector Hartwell nodded grimly. "We've sent men to her cottage, Mr. Poirot. No answer, no sign of recent occupancy. Then, mes amis, our locked room mystery has become something more complex, a puzzle with missing pieces that may prove to be the most important of all." Poirot's gaze swept the assembled suspects one final time. "Tomorrow, we shall delve deeper into the secrets of Whitmore Hall, into the hidden relationships and concealed motives that have culminated in murder. For tonight, I suggest you all rest well, for the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot are only beginning their work." The trap was set, the initial testimonies recorded, and the first threads of deception had begun to unravel. But the greatest revelations lay ahead, waiting to be discovered by the methodical mind of the world's greatest detective. The pale October dawn found Hercule Poirot in his customary state of immaculate preparation. his patent leather shoes gleaming despite the previous day's tragedy, his mustaches waxed to geometric perfection. He stood at the library window of Whitmore Hall, observing the methodical search of the grounds by Inspector Hartwell's constables, their movements as orderly as pieces on a chessboard. Yet Poirot's mind was not on the external search, but on the psychological landscape of the crime, the hidden motivations and carefully constructed deceptions that lay beneath the surface of respectability. The discovery of Margaret Vale. Inspector Hartwell's arrival in the breakfast room carried with it the satisfaction of a man who believed he had solved a crucial piece of the puzzle. "Mr. Poirot, we've located Miss Margaret Vale. She's alive, but the circumstances are most peculiar." The cottage that housed Ashcroft's secretary stood at the village edge, its windows dark and unwelcoming in the morning light. Inside, Margaret Vale lay unconscious in her bed, her breathing shallow and labored. Dr. Morrison, hastily summoned from his rounds, confirmed what the local chemist had already suspected from analyzing the dregs of her bedside teacup. "Laudanum poisoning," the doctor announced grimly, "but administered with surgical precision. Too much and she would have died within hours. Too little and she would have awakened in time for yesterday's unveiling. Someone wanted her unconscious but alive. A witness silenced, but not permanently removed." Poirot examined the cottage with characteristic thoroughness. The front door bore no signs of forced entry. Miss Vale's appointment book lay open to the previous day. Whitmore Hall, Caravaggio unveiling. 2:00 p.m., written in her precise handwriting. Most tellingly, her tea service sat arranged with military precision. 1 cup used, 1 clean, as if she had been expecting a visitor who had declined refreshment. The case against Timothy. Inspector Hartwell's confidence grew as the morning progressed. Hidden within Miss Vale's desk, beneath a stack of business correspondence, lay a bundle of letters tied with red ribbon, all bearing Timothy Ashcroft's distinctive handwriting and increasingly desperate tone. "My dear Margaret," read one letter dated 3 weeks prior, "I find myself in circumstances most dire. The gambling debts have mounted beyond my ability to service, and certain unsavory gentlemen have made it clear that patience is not among their virtues. Uncle Vivian remains adamant in his refusal to advance my inheritance." A more recent letter, dated merely 5 days before the murder, contained even more damning language. "The Caravaggio represents our salvation. If Uncle Vivian will not share his fortune willingly, perhaps circumstances will force his hand. Your discretion in this matter is paramount." But it was the physical evidence that seemed to seal Timothy's fate. In his bedroom, tucked beneath a loose floorboard that any thorough search would inevitably discover, lay a promissory note for £50,000 to one Silas Blackwood, a sum that represented financial ruin for the young heir. The note's terms were explicit. Failure to pay by month's end would result in the forfeiture of certain assets. "Consider the timeline," Inspector Hartwell argued as they stood once again in the death-marked library. Timothy admits to leaving the drawing-room briefly to take a telephone call at precisely the time when the murder occurred. He knew the house intimately, knew his uncle's routines, knew the value of the painting. Poirot's methodical objections. Yet even as the local authorities prepared to arrest Timothy Ashcroft, Hercule Poirot found himself troubled by inconsistencies that multiplied rather than resolved under scrutiny. He stood before the empty gilt frame, his fingers tracing the careful arrangement of mounting hardware that had been preserved with almost reverent precision. "Inspector," he said finally, his voice carrying the patient tone of a master addressing a promising but misguided student, "your theory possesses a certain superficial elegance, yet it fails to account for several crucial elements that the little grey cells find most disturbing." "Such as?" "The psychology, mon ami. Observe this young man, nervous, impulsive, given to emotional outbursts when confronted with his debts. Yet our crime was committed with the methodical precision of a master craftsman. each mounting tack preserved and arranged by size, the canvas removed without damage, the scene staged to create an impossible locked-room mystery. Poirot moved to the fireplace where evidence had been burned, with calculated efficiency. Furthermore, consider the convenience of the evidence against him. Letters hidden where any search would find them, a promissory note tucked beneath a loose floorboard like a treasure map leading to guilt. If Timothy planned this crime, would he leave such obvious trails? Or would someone else, someone far more clever, arrange for these breadcrumbs to be discovered? The deeper deception. The laudanum dosage troubles Poirot greatly, he continued, his voice taking on the contemplative tone that signaled deep analysis. To calculate the precise amount needed to render Miss Vale unconscious for exactly the right duration. This requires medical knowledge, chemical expertise, and most importantly, intimate familiarity with her habits and schedule. Inspector Hartwell frowned. You're suggesting the evidence was planted? I'm suggesting that we are dealing with a mind far more sophisticated than that of a desperate gambling addict. Someone who understands not merely how to commit murder, but how to direct suspicion away from themselves and toward a convenient scapegoat. Poirot turned to face the assembled company with the bearing of a conductor preparing to orchestrate a symphony of revelation. The true killer possesses three crucial qualities that Timothy lacks: the technical knowledge to remove a masterpiece without damage, the medical expertise to drug Miss Vale with surgical precision, and most importantly, the psychological sophistication to construct an elaborate deception that would fool even experienced investigators. The real investigation begins. As the morning light strengthened across the Yorkshire countryside, Poirot prepared for the deeper investigation that lay ahead. The false lead of Timothy's guilt had served its purpose, revealing the surface tensions and obvious motives while concealing the true currents of deception that flowed beneath. We shall interview each suspect again, he announced to Inspector Hartwell. This time, we shall look beyond the convenient explanations that present themselves so readily. For in Poirot's experience, the most obvious suspect is rarely the guilty party. They are merely the one the true killer wishes us to notice. He paused at the library threshold, his hand resting on the frame where violence had shattered the tranquility of scholarly pursuit. Someone in this house possesses secrets they believe safely hidden, knowledge they have not shared, and, most dangerously, the arrogance to believe they can outwit Hercule Poirot. But there are no perfect crimes, mes amis, only imperfect criminals who mistake cleverness for wisdom. The first false lead had been exposed and discarded like a discarded chess piece. Now the real game would begin, a psychological duel between the greatest detective in England and a killer whose cunning had nearly created the illusion of an impossible crime. But the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot had never met their match, and justice would not be denied by mere cleverness, however elaborate its disguise. The morning light streaming through the tall windows of Whitmore Hall's library cast long shadows across the Persian carpet, where violence had so recently intruded upon scholarly tranquility. Hercule Poirot stood before the empty gilt frame with the bearing of a master craftsman examining his tools, his immaculate appearance unchanged despite the weight of investigation that pressed upon the ancient manor. With characteristic precision, he had arranged upon the mahogany desk a curious collection of objects: brass mounting tacks sorted by size, a square of aged canvas, a length of silk cord, and a small crystal magnifying glass that caught the light like a jewel. The theatre of truth, mes amis, Poirot announced as the assembled suspects took their places in the chairs he had positioned with geometric exactitude. Today we shall conduct what you might call an experiment in human nature. For murder, it is never merely about the physical act. It is about the psychology that drives one person to destroy another. Inspector Hartwell observed from the doorway, his practical Yorkshire sensibilities somewhat bewildered by Poirot's theatrical methods, yet grudgingly respectful of their effectiveness. The Belgian detective moved among his props with the reverence of a priest arranging sacred objects, each placement calculated to maximum psychological effect. "Someone in this room," Poirot continued, his voice carrying the silk-wrapped steel of absolute certainty, "possesses knowledge they believe safely hidden. They have constructed an elaborate deception, arranged evidence to implicate an innocent party, and believe their superior intellect sufficient to outwit justice itself." Lady Fairfax and the art of deception. Poirot's penetrating gaze settled upon Lady Constance Fairfax, with the intensity of a surgeon preparing for delicate work. "Lady Fairfax, your expertise in the handling of masterpieces is legendary. If one wished to remove a painting of the Caravaggio's significance without causing damage, what would be the proper technique?" The elderly dowager's aristocratic composure wavered almost imperceptibly. "Really, Monsieur Poirot, this line of inquiry is most improper. On the contrary, it is precisely proper. Our thief removed the Caravaggio with exquisite care. Note how the mounting tacks were preserved and arranged by size. Such reverence suggests not mere criminal intent, but professional appreciation." Despite her obvious reluctance, intellectual pride compelled Lady Fairfax forward. If one must handle such a work, one would first release the tension gradually, never pry with crude instruments. The tacks must be loosened in sequence, preserved carefully as some frames possess unique fittings. The canvas should be lifted from the lower edge first, to prevent sagging, and never, under any circumstances, should one touch the painted surface directly. "Merci, madame. You speak with considerable experience." "With education," she corrected sharply, though Poirot noted how her gloved fingers trembled slightly as she spoke, "which in some quarters remains unfashionable." Poirot consulted his leather notebook with theatrical precision. "Yesterday evening, certain telephone inquiries revealed interesting information about the financial pressures facing even the most distinguished collectors in these modern times. The costs of insurance, security, preservation, they can become quite overwhelming, can they not?" Lady Fairfax's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "How dare you pry into my private affairs? My financial arrangements are no concern of yours." "Ah, but when those arrangements might provide motive for acquiring valuable artworks through alternative means, they become very much Poirot's concern." Dr. Pemberton's medical precision. The detective's attention shifted to Dr. Geoffrey Pemberton with the calculated movement of a chess master. "Doctor, your medical expertise extends to pharmacology, does it not? The precise dosage required to render Miss Vale unconscious for exactly the required duration. This would demand considerable knowledge." Dr. Pemberton maintained his professional composure, yet Poirot observed the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his spectacles. "Laudanum is indeed treacherous in its effects. For a woman of Miss Vale's constitution, the margin between effective sedation and fatal overdose is quite narrow. One would need to calculate body weight, previous tolerance, the concentration of the solution." He stopped abruptly, as if realizing he had revealed more expertise than wisdom suggested. "You have treated Miss Vale previously?" "Only once, a fainting spell at a garden party last summer." "Nothing significant." Yet Poirot noted how the doctor's right forefinger rubbed against his thumb as though measuring drops, a gesture so automatic it spoke to years of pharmaceutical practice. More tellingly, a faint medicinal scent clung to the physician's clothing, not the usual carbolic, but something more complex, with notes of clove oil and camphor. Timothy's convenient guilt. "Monsieur Timothy," Poirot said, turning to the young heir whose nervous energy was palpable in the morning air, "your uncle's death has indeed solved your immediate financial difficulties. Yet the evidence against you presents itself with suspicious convenience." Timothy's face went pale. "I've told you. I needed money, yes, but I would never commit murder. Those letters, that promissory note, anyone could have placed them in my room." "Précisément. In Poirot's experience, when evidence arranges itself so obviously, it is often because someone has taken great care to ensure its discovery. You are perhaps not the killer, but rather the intended victim of a most sophisticated frame. The housekeeper's secrets. Mrs. Hartwell entered quietly with the tea service, her movements betraying the nervous energy of someone whose ordered world had been shattered. As she arranged the china with practiced precision, Poirot observed how each suspect's attention was drawn to her presence. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said suddenly, causing the housekeeper to start slightly. "In your 30 years of faithful service, you have been the keeper of many secrets, have you not? The comings and goings of guests, the private conversations overheard, the small domestic dramas that reveal so much about human nature." "I've always minded my own business, sir," she replied carefully, though her hands trembled as she set down the tea service. "Yet yesterday you discovered something unprecedented. A library door locked during daylight hours, something that had never occurred in 3 decades of service. Tell me, who else besides yourself and Monsieur Ashcroft possessed knowledge of the household routine sufficient to exploit this anomaly?" The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the measured ticking of the grandfather clock. Mrs. Hartwell's face had gone ashen, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Dr. Pemberton knew the house well, sir. He'd been visiting for over 20 years, and Lady Fairfax had been here many times for private viewings. As for Master Timothy—" She trailed off, unwilling to voice suspicions about her employer's heir. The psychological pressure builds. Poirot moved to the fireplace where evidence had been burned with calculated efficiency. Among the ashes, he had discovered more than charred paper, fragments of leather and what appeared to be silk thread, suggesting something more substantial had been destroyed. "Someone among you," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of inevitable justice, "burned evidence in this very fireplace. Not in panic, but with methodical precision. The fire was built specifically to consume particular items, while leaving just enough trace to suggest accident rather than design." He paused before each suspect in turn, his keen eyes cataloguing every nervous gesture, every telltale sign of guilt or innocence. The killer possesses 3 crucial qualities: the technical knowledge to remove a masterpiece without damage, the medical expertise to drug Miss Vale with surgical precision, and most importantly, the psychological sophistication to construct an elaborate deception. The trap tightens. "This afternoon," Poirot announced with theatrical finality, "Miss Vale is expected to regain consciousness. When she does, she will undoubtedly have much to tell us about her unexpected visitor, the person who brought her tea laced with laudanum, who spoke with her about the day's events, who ensured her silence during the crucial hours." The atmosphere in the library had grown thick with tension, each suspect now acutely aware that their carefully constructed facades were crumbling under Poirot's relentless psychological pressure. The detective had not made direct accusations, but he had planted seeds of doubt and fear that would grow and flourish in guilty minds. "Until then," he concluded, adjusting a crystal paperweight to perfect alignment with the desk's edge, "I suggest you all consider whether confession freely given might be preferable to exposure publicly made. For the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot have detected the fatal flaw in your perfect crime, the one element that no amount of physical evidence can overcome, the impossibility of concealing the human heart's true nature." The psychological game had reached its crescendo, and somewhere among the assembled suspects, a killer was beginning to realize that their elaborate deception was no match for the methodical mind of the world's greatest detective. The trap was closing, and justice would not be denied by mere cleverness, however sophisticated its disguise. The pale afternoon light filtering through the muslin curtains of Whitmore Hall's makeshift infirmary carried with it the hushed expectancy of revelation. Margaret Vale stirred against her pillows with the deliberate precision of one whose professional habits survived even the fog of laudanum, her wire-rimmed spectacles catching the light as Dr. Morrison completed his examination with practiced efficiency. Hercule Poirot arranged himself in the bedside chair with characteristic care, adjusting its position to achieve perfect alignment with the geometric pattern of the carpet. His immaculate appearance, from his precisely waxed mustaches to his patent leather shoes, spoke to a mind that demanded order even in the midst of chaos. Inspector Hartwell stood by the window, notebook ready, his practical Yorkshire sensibilities anticipating straightforward identification of the culprit. The secretary's awakening. Mademoiselle Vale, Poirot began, his accented voice carrying the gentle authority of a confessor. You have slept the sleep of the drugged, but now the little grey cells of Poirot require your assistance. Can you tell us of your visitor yesterday morning? Miss Vale's eyes focused with the gradual clarity of one emerging from deep waters. Tea, she whispered, her voice hoarse from her ordeal. Someone came for tea just after noon. The voice was familiar, cultured, speaking of the afternoon's unveiling with such excitement. This person, you recognized them. Not at first. The laudanum, it clouds memory like fog over the moors. But they spoke of Mr. Ashcroft, of the Caravaggio, of how everything would change after today. Her hand trembled as she reached for the water glass Dr. Morrison offered. They said the painting would make history, but not in the way anyone expected. Inspector Hartwell leaned forward eagerly. Can you describe this person, their appearance, their manner? But Miss Vale's next words shattered the comfortable assumptions that had guided their investigation thus far. They told me something that changed everything. I thought I knew about Mr. Ashcroft's great acquisition. The Caravaggio, it was not what it appeared to be. The devastating revelation. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the measured ticking of the mantelpiece clock. Poirot's keen eyes never left Miss Vale's face as she struggled to organize memories fragmented by chemical interference. Mr. Ashcroft had discovered the truth, she continued, her voice gaining strength as the words flowed. The painting was a forgery, brilliant, sophisticated, but worthless. He had commissioned a private analysis, technical examinations that revealed the deception. Yesterday's unveiling was not to be a celebration of acquisition, but an exposure of fraud. Dr. Morrison dropped his stethoscope with a clatter that seemed to echo through the stunned silence. Inspector Hartwell's pen remained poised above his notebook, forgotten in the magnitude of this revelation. He was going to destroy someone, Miss Vale whispered, her eyes wide with the terror of understanding. Someone whose reputation, whose fortune, whose very life depended upon the Caravaggio's authenticity. He called it his greatest triumph, to expose one of the most sophisticated art frauds in history. The Black Book of Evidence. Poirot rose from his chair and began to pace with measured steps, his mind already racing to reorganize the entire framework of the case. This private analysis, where did Monsieur Ashcroft keep the documentation? His black book, Miss Vale replied immediately. A leather-bound journal where he recorded all his confidential findings, technical reports, photographic evidence, chemical analyses, even the names of those he suspected of involvement in the forgery. He always kept it with him during important negotiations. And yesterday, he had it in the library, ready for the unveiling. He planned to present the evidence publicly, to expose not just the forgery, but the entire network that had perpetrated it. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He said it would send shockwaves through the art world from London to Paris to New York. Poirot stopped his pacing abruptly, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of pieces falling into place. The burned evidence in the fireplace, leather and silk thread. Your employer's black book has been destroyed, along with all proof of the forgery. The cottage violation Inspector Hartwell cleared his throat. Mr. Poirot, while you were conducting this interview, my constables discovered something disturbing at Miss Vale's cottage. Someone has been there, searching, removing items. They made their way to the ivy-covered cottage in grim procession, finding subtle but unmistakable signs of intrusion. The front door, which Miss Vale swore she always locked, stood slightly ajar. Inside, the evidence of methodical search was everywhere, not the chaos of desperate ransacking, but the careful work of someone who understood exactly what they sought. Books had been removed from shelves and replaced in slightly different positions. The escritoire, where Miss Vale kept her correspondence, showed signs of expert manipulation. The lock coaxed rather than forced, the false back of the secret compartment hanging open like an accusation. "The backup documentation," Miss Vale gasped as she surveyed the violation of her private space. Mr. Ashcroft always insisted on duplicate records. "I kept copies of the most sensitive materials here, hidden away for safekeeping." Poirot examined the scene with characteristic thoroughness, noting details others missed. A thin smear of candle wax on the windowsill, positioned precisely to hold the sash at the correct angle for threading something slender through the bars. The faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air despite the cottage's ventilation. Most tellingly, a single thread of pale blue silk caught on a splinter of the damaged compartment. Silk of a quality that spoke to wealth and refinement. The reframing of motives back at Whitmore Hall, the revelation of the Caravaggios' fraudulent nature transformed every aspect of their investigation. Poirot gathered the remaining suspects in the library, his manner carrying the weight of absolute certainty despite the complexity of the deception they now faced. "Mes amis," he announced, his voice cutting through the afternoon shadows. "We have been investigating the wrong crime entirely. This was never about the theft of a masterpiece, but about the concealment of a fraud. Someone among you has orchestrated not merely murder, but one of the most sophisticated deceptions in the history of art collecting." Lady Fairfax sat rigid in her chair, her aristocratic composure intact, but her gloved hands trembling almost imperceptibly. Timothy paced by the windows with nervous energy, while Mrs. Hartwell stood frozen by the doorway like a faithful sentinel whose world had been turned upside down. The killer possessed intimate knowledge of Monsieur Ashcroft's routines, his investigation, his planned exposure of the forgery. They drugged Miss Vale to prevent her attendance, murdered Ashcroft to silence him permanently, and destroyed all evidence of the fraud. Most cleverly, they staged the theft of the worthless painting to maintain the illusion of its value. The psychological trap tightens. Poirot moved to the empty gilt frame, his fingers tracing the careful arrangement of mounting hardware that had been preserved with almost reverent precision. The meticulous removal of the canvas, the preservation of every mounting tech, this was not the work of a common thief, but of someone who understood the painting's true nature and wished to reclaim their handiwork. He turned to face the assembled suspects, his keen eyes cataloguing every nervous gesture, every telltale sign of guilt or innocence. Someone in this room created that forgery, arranged its sale to Monsieur Ashcroft, and when discovery threatened, committed murder to protect their secret. The locked room was not designed to prevent entry, but to control the narrative of the crime. The evidence points to someone with artistic expertise, medical knowledge for the precise dosing of laudanum, and most importantly, desperate financial need that drove them to such elaborate deception. The little gray cells of Hercule Poirot have identified the fatal flaw in your perfect crime, the impossibility of concealing the human heart's true nature when faced with exposure and ruin. The approaching climax. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the Persian carpet where violence had so recently intruded, Poirot prepared for the final confrontation that would expose a killer whose sophistication had nearly created the perfect crime. The forgery revelation had transformed their locked room mystery into something far more complex, a web of deception that spanned months of careful planning and culminated in murder. "Tomorrow morning," he announced with theatrical finality, "we shall gather for the final revelation. The killer believes their secret safe, their elaborate deception successful, their evidence destroyed beyond recovery. But they have reckoned without the methodical mind of Hercule Poirot, and justice will not be denied by mere cleverness, however sophisticated its disguise." The trap was closing, the psychological pressure mounting, and somewhere among the assembled suspects, a killer was beginning to realize that their masterpiece of deception was no match for the greatest detective in England. The endgame was approaching, and truth would not remain buried beneath layers of lies and misdirection. The morning light filtering through the tall windows of Whitmore Hall cast long shadows across the Persian carpet, where violence had so recently intruded upon scholarly tranquility. Hercule Poirot stood alone in the library, his immaculate figure a study in geometric precision against the chaos of human passion that had unfolded within these walls. His patent leather shoes gleamed despite the weight of investigation. His mustaches waxed to mathematical perfection, the external order that reflected the methodical workings of his legendary mind. The silent witness of leather and time, Poirot, approached the mahogany desk where Ashcroft had met his violent end, his keen eyes focusing on a detail so minute that even trained investigators had overlooked its significance. The morning light, striking the leather desktop at precisely the correct angle, revealed the faintest of impressions, ghostly traces of handwriting pressed through multiple layers of paper with passionate intensity. "Ah," he murmured, producing his crystal magnifying glass and positioning it with characteristic precision. When one writes with great emotion upon paper resting atop leather, the pressure creates an impression that persists long after the original document has been destroyed. The words were fragmentary, but unmistakably clear to those who knew how to read the shadows of truth. Final payment due upon successful completion. Reproduction must pass all technical analysis. Reputation depends upon absolute discretion. The very contract that had guaranteed payment for the fraudulent Caravaggio, written by the forger themselves, now served as silent testimony to their guilt. The mechanics of impossibility. But it was the locked door that had provided the killer's greatest theatrical triumph, the creation of an impossible crime designed to deflect suspicion entirely. Poirot moved to examine the heavy oak portal with the reverence of a master craftsman studying his tools. The lock was an older mortise design, with a substantial key and, internally, a small snib that permitted the door to be secured without the key. Kneeling with the unassuming posture that had caused so many criminals to underestimate him, Poirot observed a faint crescent of dullness on the inner escutcheon where polish had been abraded in a narrow arc. Below, on the brass threshold strip, lay the tiniest scratch across the grain, evidence of something thin and strong being drawn beneath the door. From his waistcoat pocket, he withdrew a narrow envelope containing a single filament of pale blue silk, so light that his breath might have disturbed it. With methodical precision, he demonstrated the mechanism. Silk thread passed beneath the door, looped around the internal snib, and manipulated from the corridor to lock the door from outside while creating the illusion of internal security. "Voila," he said softly to the empty room. "The impossible becomes merely ingenious when one understands the method." The betrayal of time. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall had provided an additional clue, though one that required intimate knowledge of the household's peculiarities to exploit effectively. Poirot compared his own pocket watch with the ancient timepiece, confirming what Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned in passing. The clock ran 8 minutes fast, a vanity of Ashcroft's to ensure punctuality among guests and staff. A killer setting their mechanism by ear alone would be betrayed by this domestic quirk unless they possessed detailed knowledge of the house's rhythms. The precision required spoke to someone whose presence at Whitmore Hall was not merely tolerated, but expected, someone who belonged. The chemical testament. In the fireplace, among the carefully arranged ashes, Poirot had discovered more than the obvious remnants of the destroyed black book. Traces of photographic emulsion clung to the partially burned fragments, evidence of technical documentation that would have proven the Caravaggio's fraudulent nature beyond doubt. X-ray analysis, spectroscopic evidence, ultraviolet photography, all the sophisticated tools of modern art authentication, now reduced to guilty ash. But photographic emulsion contains silver compounds that resist complete combustion, and these traces would provide definitive proof of what had been destroyed. More importantly, they revealed the killer's access to professional-grade documentation that only someone with intimate knowledge of Ashcroft's investigation could have possessed. The hidden workshop, Poirot's methodical search of Whitmore Hall's less frequented spaces, had yielded evidence that transformed their understanding of the crime's true scope. Concealed in the coal cellar, wrapped in oiled cloth with the care of someone protecting precious instruments, lay an artist's kit of remarkable sophistication. Brushes arranged by size with obsessive precision, tubes of paint in colors that spoke to centuries of artistic tradition, bottles of aging solution whose chemical composition could fool even expert analysis. Most tellingly, a small leather case containing pharmaceutical measuring devices graduated to the milliliter. Instruments designed for exact dosage calculation of substances like laudanum. The workshop revealed not merely a single fraudulent painting, but an entire criminal enterprise spanning years of sophisticated forgeries. Bank drafts from continental collectors, correspondence with auction houses, receipts for materials representing thousands of pounds invested in deception, all hidden beneath the very house where their final victim had lived and died. The psychological portrait, as Poirot assembled these fragments into a coherent whole, the psychological profile of their killer emerged with crystalline clarity. Someone who possessed artistic genius sufficient to fool expert authentication, medical knowledge to drug victims with surgical precision, and most dangerously, the arrogance to believe their superior intellect could outwit justice itself. The meticulous arrangement of mounting tacks by size, the careful preservation of the canvas during its removal, the precise calculation of laudanum dosage, all spoke to a mind that demanded perfection even in criminality. This was not a crime of passion, but a masterwork of deception, planned and executed, with the same attention to detail that had created the fraudulent masterpiece itself. The fatal thread, yet in their very perfection lay the seeds of destruction. The pale blue silk thread caught on the library threshold matched exactly the broken loop in Lady Fairfax's hand-stitched glove seam. The quality wax found at both the library window and Miss Vale's cottage carried the distinctive scent of expensive candles, citrus and smoke, that spoke to refined tastes and careful habits. Most damning of all was the psychological consistency that ran through every aspect of the crime. The same obsessive attention to detail that had created a perfect forgery had also preserved mounting tacks by size, arranged evidence with geometric precision, and left behind traces that only the most methodical investigation could detect. The moment of truth, standing alone in the death-marked library, Hercule Poirot felt the familiar satisfaction of pieces falling into perfect alignment. The locked room mystery, the drugged secretary, the destroyed evidence, the staged theft, all elements of an elaborate performance designed to conceal the simple truth that a forger had murdered to protect their criminal enterprise. "The little grey cells," he murmured, adjusting a crystal paperweight to achieve perfect alignment with the desk's geometric pattern. "They do not lie. They reveal not merely what happened, but why it was inevitable that it should happen precisely as it did." The final preparation. As the morning light strengthened across the Yorkshire countryside, Poirot prepared for the theatrical climax that would expose a killer whose sophistication had nearly created the perfect crime. The evidence was assembled, the psychological profile complete, the method understood in all its ingenious complexity. Tonight, he would gather all suspects for the final revelation. The killer believed their secret safe, their elaborate deception successful, their evidence destroyed beyond recovery. But they had reckoned without the methodical mind of Hercule Poirot, and justice would not be denied by mere genius, however sophisticated its criminal application. The hidden clue had been revealed, not a single piece of evidence, but a constellation of details that, when properly arranged, illuminated the truth with the clarity of mathematical proof. The trap was set, the final act prepared, and somewhere in Whitmore Hall, a killer was about to discover that even the most perfect crime contains within it the instruments of its own exposure. The little gray cells had done their work, and truth would not remain buried beneath layers of artistic genius and psychological manipulation. The endgame was approaching, and Hercule Poirot was ready to conduct the final movement of his symphony of justice. The drawing room of Whitmore Hall had been transformed under Hercule Poirot's exacting supervision into a theatre of justice, its every detail arranged with the precision of a master conductor preparing for his greatest performance. The lamps glowed like footlights upon a stage long rehearsed, casting dramatic shadows across the Persian carpet that would serve as his platform for revelation. Upon the polished mahogany side table, he had arranged his evidence with reverent care. A coil of pale blue silk thread in its crystal envelope, the leather desk blotter bearing ghostly impressions of guilt, a stoppered vial labeled Laudanum Tincturopiae, the brass door snib removed from its housing, and a square of expensive candle wax that carried the faint, luxurious scent of citrus wreathed in smoke. The Assembly of Justice. The chairs formed a perfect semicircle before the marble fireplace, each positioned at precisely the same distance from the carpet's geometric center. Inspector Hartwell stood by the doorway with notebook ready, his practical Yorkshire sensibilities somewhat awed by the theatrical precision of Poirot's arrangements. Mrs. Hartwell, faithful keeper of household secrets for 3 decades, occupied a chair near the servants' entrance, her weathered hands folded with the resignation of one whose ordered world had been forever altered. Lady Constance Fairfax entered with the bearing of aristocracy facing judgment, her 73 years carried with dignity despite the tremor in her gloved hands that she could no longer entirely suppress. The pale blue silk of her glove seam caught the lamplight, a detail that did not escape Poirot's methodical observation. Timothy Ashcroft followed, his nervous energy palpable as he took his assigned seat, while Dr. Geoffrey Pemberton maintained the professional composure that had served him through decades of medical practice, though one finger tapped an unconscious rhythm against his cuff. Tap, 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 like a man measuring drops. Margaret Vale, still pale from her ordeal but determined to witness justice for her murdered employer, sat with a precise posture that spoke to years of secretarial discipline. Her spectacles caught the light like twin signals of truth waiting to be revealed. The opening movement. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his accented voice carrying the silk-wrapped steel of absolute certainty, "we gather tonight to witness the conclusion of a most extraordinary case, what appeared to be a locked-room mystery that challenged every assumption about the nature of impossible crimes. Yet as the little gray cells have discovered, there are no impossible crimes, only elaborate deceptions designed to conceal the simple truth of human greed and desperation." He moved among his carefully arranged props with the reverence of a priest handling sacred objects, each placement calculated to maximum psychological effect. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall chimed the quarter hour. 8 minutes fast, as always, a domestic quirk that would prove crucial to understanding the crime's precise timing. 3 days ago, Vivian Ashcroft died in his locked library, and a priceless Caravaggio vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Yet as we have learned, mes amis, appearances can be most deceiving, and the truth that lies beneath this carefully constructed facade is far more complex than mere theft and murder. The revelation of method. Poirot lifted the crystal envelope containing the pale blue silk thread, allowing the lamplight to catch its delicate fibers. Let us begin with the illusion of the locked room. Mrs. Hartwell's discovery of a library door secured from within, a circumstance unheard of in 30 years of faithful service. This created the perfect alibi for anyone outside the room, the foundation upon which our killer built their elaborate deception. With theatrical precision, he demonstrated the mechanism using a wooden panel propped between two chairs. Threading the silk beneath the mock door's edge, he looped it around the brass snib with two deft motions and, standing outside the arc, drew the filament taut. The snib clicked home with decisive finality. "Voila," he said with a slight bow. "The impossible becomes merely ingenious when one understands the method. One requires a filament that is strong, fine, and obedient to the hand. Silk of the quality found in expensive glove seams, perhaps. The faint scratch on the brass threshold, the minute dulling on the inner escutcheon where the thread abraded the metal, these are the telltale signs of such manipulation." Lady Fairfax's fan snapped open with a dry crack, her aristocratic composure showing the first hairline fractures under pressure. Dr. Pemberton's rhythmic tapping ceased abruptly, his hands folding with professional control. The forgery exposed. But the locked room was merely the theatrical flourish. Poirot continued, his voice gaining momentum like a gathering storm. The true deception lay in the nature of the crime itself. Our investigation began with the assumption that we were dealing with the theft of a masterpiece worth more than most men earn in several lifetimes. Yet the meticulous care with which the painting was removed, observe these mounting tacks, preserved and arranged by size with obsessive precision, suggested not theft, but reclamation. He gestured to the small saucer where the brass tacks sat in perfect geometric order. No common thief preserves the little brass soldiers in such formation. This was the hand of an artist or a conservator, or one who has masqueraded as both throughout a long career of sophisticated deception. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Timothy's sharp intake of breath. Poirot allowed the weight of implication to settle before delivering his devastating revelation. "The Caravaggio was a forgery," he announced with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Brilliant, sophisticated, capable of fooling even expert authentication for months or years, but worthless nonetheless. Monsieur Ashcroft had discovered this truth through private technical analysis and planned to expose not merely the fraud, but the entire criminal enterprise that had perpetrated it." A collective gasp went through the room. Lady Fairfax's gloved hands trembled visibly. Timothy stared with mouth agape, and even Mrs. Hartwell's composed features showed shock at this revelation. The documentary evidence Poirot lifted the leather desk blotter, positioning it under the lamplight to reveal the ghostly impressions pressed into its surface. When one writes with great emotion upon paper resting atop leather, the pressure creates an impression that persists long after guilt believes all evidence destroyed. Under magnification, one reads the echoes of a contract. Final payment upon successful completion. Reproduction must pass all technical analysis. Absolute discretion. This was the commission for the fraudulent masterpiece, written by the forger's own hand. He moved to the fireplace, where evidence had been burned with calculated efficiency. Monsieur Ashcroft's black book, his documentation of the fraud, was reduced to ash in this very grate. Yet among the charred remains, we find traces of photographic emulsion, chemical compounds that resist complete combustion, X-ray analyses, spectroscopic evidence, ultraviolet photography, all the sophisticated tools of modern art authentication, destroyed to conceal the truth. The drugged witness. "Miss Vale," Poirot said, turning to the secretary with characteristic courtesy, "you were silenced not by coincidence, but by calculated design. The precise dosage of laudanum required to render you unconscious for exactly the crucial hours. Too much, and you would have died. Too little, and you would have awakened in time for the unveiling. This demanded medical knowledge and intimate familiarity with your constitution." He held up the pharmaceutical vial, its contents glinting in the lamplight. "To calculate body weight, previous tolerance, the concentration of the solution, this requires the expertise of one trained in the medical arts, one accustomed to measuring drops with surgical precision." Dr. Pemberton's jaw muscle worked almost imperceptibly, his professional mask slipping for just a moment before reasserting itself. The hidden workshop. But perhaps most revealing of all, Poirot continued, producing the artist's kit retrieved from the coal cellar, is this sophisticated workshop hidden beneath the very house where the victim lived and died. Brushes arranged by size with obsessive precision, pigments aged to perfection, chemical solutions capable of fooling expert analysis. This is no amateur's collection, but a laboratory of deception spanning years of criminal enterprise. The tools gleamed in the lamplight like instruments of both creation and destruction. Bank drafts, correspondence with continental collectors, receipts for materials representing thousands of pounds invested in fraud, all the evidence of a criminal career built upon artistic genius perverted to illegal purpose. The psychological portrait. Our killer possesses 3 crucial qualities, Poirot announced, his voice carrying the weight of inevitable justice. Artistic genius sufficient to create forgeries that fool expert authentication, medical knowledge to calculate precise dosages without causing death, and, most dangerously, the psychological sophistication to orchestrate an elaborate deception spanning months of careful planning. His keen eyes moved from suspect to suspect, cataloging every nervous gesture, every telltale sign of mounting panic. The same obsessive attention to detail that created a perfect forgery also demanded perfection in murder. They could not bring themselves to leave mounting tacks scattered in chaos, could not abandon their need for geometric precision, even in the commission of violence. The tightening net. The pale blue silk thread caught on the library threshold matches exactly a broken seam in hand-stitched gloves, Poirot revealed, his gaze settling briefly on Lady Fairfax's trembling hands. The quality wax found at both crime scenes carries the distinctive scent of expensive candles that speak to refined tastes and habitual use. The pharmaceutical measuring devices hidden in the workshop reveal medical knowledge applied to criminal purpose. He paused before the empty gilt frame, his fingers tracing the careful arrangement of mounting hardware that had been preserved with almost reverent precision. Someone in this room drugged Miss Vale to prevent her attendance, murdered Monsieur Ashcroft to silence his planned exposure, destroyed all evidence of the fraud, and staged the theft to maintain the illusion of the painting's value. Most cleverly, they arranged evidence to implicate an innocent party while believing their own guilt safely concealed. The moment of truth. The atmosphere in the drawing room had grown thick with tension, each suspect now acutely aware that their carefully constructed facades were crumbling under Poirot's relentless exposure. The detective stood before them with the bearing of justice personified, his immaculate appearance unchanged, despite the weight of revelation he carried. This individual sought to protect their reputation, their livelihood, their carefully constructed world of deception built upon artistic genius perverted to criminal purpose. Monsieur Ashcroft's exposure would have meant ruin, scandal, imprisonment, the destruction of everything they had spent years creating through fraud and forgery. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, yet it carried the force of undeniable conviction. But in their very perfection, they revealed their fatal flaw. The meticulousness that allowed them to create masterpieces of deception also forced them to be precise in their crime. They valued their reputation above all else. Someone who, even in the act of murder, could not abandon their obsessive need for order and control. The final preparation. Poirot gathered his evidence with delicate care, aligning each piece until the arrangement pleased his geometric sensibilities. The grandfather clock chimed again. Wrong, obstinate, 8 minutes ahead of truth, yet providing the final clue to someone whose intimate knowledge of the house's rhythms had enabled their impossible crime. The little grey cells of Hercule Poirot have identified the killer, understood their method, and assembled proof of their guilt that no amount of sophistication can overcome, he announced with theatrical finality. Tomorrow morning, I shall place before you the last small facts, the tiny details that together form a signature more certain than handwriting. Then, mesdames et messieurs, we shall speak of names." He bowed slightly to the assembled company, his manner carrying a note of almost gentle pity. "Sleep, if you can, for justice will not be denied by mere genius, however elaborate its criminal application. The trap is closing, and truth will not remain buried beneath layers of artistic brilliance and psychological manipulation." Somewhere in the crescent of chairs, a breath came too quickly, a glove seam caught the light too tellingly, fingers tapped an unconscious rhythm of guilt and fear. And Poirot, who heard more in silence than most men hear in confession, knew that the moment of final revelation was at hand. The endgame was approaching, and the greatest detective in England was ready to conduct the final movement of his symphony of justice. The drawing-room of Whitmore Hall had been transformed into a theatre of justice, its every detail arranged with the precision that had become Hercule Poirot's signature. The lamps cast dramatic pools of light upon the Persian carpet, illuminating the assembled company who sat in the exact semicircle that the Belgian detective had orchestrated with mathematical precision. Upon the mahogany side table lay the instruments of revelation, a crystal envelope containing pale blue silk thread, the leather desk blotter bearing ghostly impressions of guilt, a stoppered vial of laudanum, the brass door-snib, and a collection of artists' tools that spoke to decades of sophisticated deception, the elimination of false leads. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his accented voice carrying the silk-wrapped steel of absolute certainty, "we gather for the final act of our little drama. For 3 days, we have witnessed what appeared to be an impossible crime, a locked-room mystery that challenged every assumption about the nature of murder and theft. Yet as the little grey cells have discovered, there are no impossible crimes, only elaborate deceptions designed to conceal the simple truth of human desperation." His penetrating gaze moved systematically across each face, cataloguing the subtle signs of mounting tension that betrayed inner turmoil. "Let us first clear away the shadows that have obscured our vision. Lady Fairfax, your aristocratic bearing and expertise in art handling made you an obvious suspect. The silk thread, the expensive candles, the financial pressures whispered in London's most exclusive circles, all pointed toward your possible guilt." Lady Constance sat rigid in her chair, her gloved hands trembling almost imperceptibly. "Yet you are not our murderer," Poirot continued gently. "Your psychology rebels against such vulgarity. You are a collector, possessive and proud, but you would sooner consign yourself to ruin than commit violence with a bronze statuette. Moreover, the silk thread that created our locked-room illusion is not the plied filament of expensive gloves, but braided surgical silk, strong, fine, and bearing the faintest trace of carbolic and eugenol." The medical connection, Poirot lifted the crystal envelope, allowing the lamplight to catch the delicate fibers within. "Clove oil, mes amis. The painter's friend to retard drying, but also the surgeon's comfort for difficult procedures. This thread came not from a lady's glove, but from a physician's suture kit." His gaze settled upon Dr. Geoffrey Pemberton with the intensity of a surgeon preparing for delicate work. The laudanum that silenced Miss Vale required calculation of extraordinary precision. Too much, and we have death. Too little, and the witness awakens in time to speak. The dosage was calculated for her constitution specifically. Knowledge gained when you treated her fainting spell last summer. Nothing significant, you said, yet significant enough to establish the baseline tolerance that enabled your precise criminal calculation. Dr. Pemberton's professional composure showed its first hairline cracks, though his voice remained steady. "Medical consultation in such matters is hardly evidence of guilt, Monsieur Poirot. The artistic deception revealed. Ah, but your expertise extends far beyond medicine, mon ami." Poirot moved to the collection of artists' tools, retrieved from the hidden workshop. These instruments speak to decades of sophisticated practice. Brushes arranged by size with obsessive precision, pigments aged through careful chemistry, solutions capable of fooling even expert analysis. This is not the hobby collection of a Sunday painter, but the professional laboratory of a master forger. He held up a small vial of aging solution, its contents gleaming amber in the lamplight. Your medical training provided the chemical knowledge necessary to age pigments artificially, to create the perfect patina of centuries. The same precision that serves you in surgery enabled you to reproduce the brushwork of Caravaggio himself with such accuracy that even seasoned experts were initially deceived. Poirot withdrew a bundle of documents, bank drafts, correspondence, receipts that painted a picture of mounting financial pressure. The gambling debts that we attributed to Timothy were merely a convenient misdirection. Your own financial difficulties far exceeded those of the young heir. The medical practice that once provided comfortable living has been drained by years of speculation and the expensive habits of a man who believed his superior intellect guaranteed success in all endeavors. The locked room mechanism. With theatrical precision, Poirot demonstrated the silk thread mechanism using the brass snib and a wooden panel. The impossible locked room becomes merely ingenious when one understands the method. Surgical silk passed beneath the door gap, looped around the internal snib, manipulated from the corridor with the steady hands of a surgeon accustomed to delicate procedures. He indicated the faint scratch on the brass threshold, the minute dulling on the inner escutcheon. These are the signatures of repeated practice, the marks left by someone who understood the house's peculiarities from 20 years of friendship. You knew that Mrs. Hartwell's discovery of an internally secured door would seem to eliminate all external suspects, the perfect alibi for a crime committed from within. The motive exposed. The Caravaggio was your masterpiece of deception, Poirot revealed, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, yet carrying the force of undeniable conviction. Created in your hidden workshop, aged with chemical precision, sold to your old friend with the confidence that your medical reputation would prevent suspicion. For years, you supplemented your declining practice with the fruits of artistic fraud, creating works that commanded prices sufficient to maintain your lifestyle. Dr. Pemberton's hands clenched involuntarily, the professional mask finally beginning to crack. Vivian was obsessed with authentication. He could never simply appreciate beauty for its own sake. So when his technical analysis threatened to expose not merely one forgery, but your entire criminal enterprise, you decided he must die. The method was ingenious. Use your medical knowledge to drug Miss Vale, preventing her crucial testimony. Enter the library during the brief window when alibis were established. Strike down your oldest friend, destroy his black book of evidence, and remove your worthless creation to maintain the illusion of theft. The physical evidence. Poirot lifted the leather desk blotter, positioning it under the lamplight to reveal ghostly impressions pressed into its surface. When one writes with great emotion upon paper resting atop leather, the pressure creates an impression that persists long after guilt believes all evidence destroyed. Final payment upon successful completion. Reproduction must pass all technical analysis. Absolute discretion, the very contract that guaranteed your payment for the fraudulent masterpiece, written by your own hand. He moved to the fireplace where evidence had been burned with calculated efficiency. You destroyed Ashcroft's black book, but photographic emulsion contains silver compounds that resist complete combustion. The traces remain, testament to the X-ray analyses, spectroscopic evidence, and ultraviolet photography that would have exposed your criminal career to the world. The psychological profile. Your personality demanded perfection, even in murder, Poirot observed, his keen eyes never leaving the physician's increasingly stricken face. You could not scatter the mounting tacks in chaos. They had to be arranged by size, preserved with the care of a conservator. The canvas had to be removed without damage, treated with the reverence of an artist reclaiming his work. Even in committing murder, you could not abandon your obsessive need for order and precision. The rhythmic tapping had returned. Tap, 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 tap. Like a man measuring drops, counting heartbeats, calculating the precise moment when deception would yield to truth. The final confrontation. The grandfather clock, Poirot continued relentlessly, provided your final advantage. 8 minutes fast, as you knew from decades of visits. When you spoke of checking your watch at 2:37, you created the perfect timeline. Alibis balanced upon a false edge because you, who knew the house's peculiarities intimately, trusted that peculiarity to protect you. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the measured ticking of that same clock. Dr. Pemberton sat with his head in his hands, the weight of exposure finally breaking through decades of carefully maintained deception. "I never meant for it to come to murder," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the shocked murmurs of the assembled company. "The forgeries were works of art in their own right. I created beauty that brought joy to collectors who could never afford authentic masterpieces. Where was the harm in that? Justice served. The harm, mon ami, lay in the deception itself," Poirot replied with gentle finality. "Art built upon lies corrupts not merely the market, but the very soul of creativity. And when that deception was threatened with exposure, it led inevitably to the greatest corruption of all, the taking of human life to preserve criminal reputation." Inspector Hartwell stepped forward, handcuffs gleaming in the lamplight. "Dr. Geoffrey Pemberton, I arrest you for the murder of Vivian Ashcroft and the attempted murder of Margaret Vale." As the physician was led away, his shoulders bowed under the weight of exposure and defeat. Poirot adjusted a crystal paperweight to achieve perfect alignment with the table's geometric pattern. The case was closed, the killer exposed, and justice served through the methodical application of logic to the chaos of human passion. The philosophical reflection. "Envy," Poirot murmured to the remaining company, "is perhaps the most destructive of human emotions. A young man at Cambridge, overshadowed by a brilliant friend with the eye and the money, nurses his resentment until it grows into something monstrous. The hands that should have healed became instruments of creation and destruction, first forging beauty, then taking life to preserve the illusion of respectability." The locked room mystery had yielded its secrets, the impossible crime revealed as merely ingenious, and the greatest detective in England had once again proven that no amount of sophistication could overcome the relentless pursuit of truth. The little grey cells had done their work, and truth would not remain buried beneath layers of artistic genius and psychological manipulation. In the end, it was not the complexity of the crime that mattered, but the simplicity of human nature, the eternal struggle between creation and destruction, between the desire for beauty and the corruption of the soul that would sacrifice everything, even friendship itself, upon the altar of pride and desperation. The pale October dawn found Whitmore Hall exhaling at last, its ancient stones settling into a quieter rhythm after 3 days of violence and deception. The metallic click of handcuffs had echoed with chilling finality through the drawing room as Dr. Geoffrey Pemberton was led away, his distinguished bearing reduced to the hollow shell and of a man whose carefully constructed world had collapsed beneath the weight of exposure. He did not look back, his gaze fixed on some inner landscape of ruin, perhaps already understanding that no amount of genius could undo the methodical pursuit of justice that had brought him to this moment. The scope of deception. Revealed Inspector Hartwell returned from his dawn search of Pemberton's surgery and private rooms with the grim satisfaction of a man whose spade had struck bedrock. "We have it all, Mr. Poirot," he announced in the library where the Belgian detective awaited with characteristic composure. 23 forgeries over 15 years, works attributed to everyone from Vermeer to Turner, sold through a network of continental dealers who asked no inconvenient questions. From sealed evidence bags, he withdrew the recovered Caravaggio forgery. its upper varnish hastily stripped to remove traces of Ashcroft's testing compounds, along with 2 additional canvases in various stages of completion. The hidden workshop had yielded treasures of criminality, bank drafts totaling more than £100,000, correspondence with auction houses across Europe, detailed technical notes on aging processes, and most damning of all, photographic plates showing X-ray analyses and ultraviolet studies that Pemberton had used to create deceptions sophisticated enough to fool the very experts who employed those authentication techniques. The irony, Poirot observed, examining a particularly detailed study of Caravaggio's brushwork, is that Dr. Pemberton possessed genuine artistic genius. These forgeries represent work of extraordinary quality. They are, in their own way, masterpieces. Yet genius without moral foundation becomes not creation, but destruction. The swift hand of justice. The legal proceedings that followed were as methodical as Poirot's investigation had been. The overwhelming weight of evidence, the surgical silk thread, the pharmaceutical measuring devices, the impressions on the leather desk blotter, the precise chemical knowledge required for both forgery and murder, left Pemberton with no credible defense. His confession, delivered with the chilling detachment of a man who viewed his crimes as intellectual exercises, detailed years of sophisticated fraud designed to maintain his lifestyle while his medical practice declined. Margaret Vale's testimony proved particularly damning. Fully recovered from her laudanum ordeal, she spoke with quiet dignity of her employer's planned exposure of the fraud, and Pemberton's visit on that fatal morning. "He spoke of the afternoon's unveiling with such excitement," she recalled, her voice steady behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "He said the painting would make history, but not in the way anyone expected. I should have understood the threat in those words." The Continental authorities expressed keen interest in the case, as several major auction houses had unknowingly sold Pemberton's forgeries for years. The financial implications ran into hundreds of thousands of pounds, affecting collectors from London to Paris to New York. Pemberton faced not merely charges of murder and attempted murder, but fraud on an international scale that had damaged confidence in the art market itself. Character transformations. The ordeal had wrought profound changes in those who survived it. Timothy Ashcroft stood by the library windows with a decisiveness that surprised those who had known him as weak and dissolute. "I shall sell the collection," he announced with newfound purpose. "Uncle Vivian's passion for beauty deserves better than to be tainted by association with fraud and murder. The proceeds will establish a foundation for art authentication, something to prevent other collectors from falling victim to such sophisticated deceptions." Lady Constance Fairfax, her aristocratic bearing intact despite the ordeal of suspicion she had endured, offered her considerable influence to support Timothy's endeavors. "I shall advise," she said with characteristic crispness, "on one condition, that you pledge never to acquire a work whose past you cannot vouchsafe completely." "I promise," Timothy replied with a humility that did not sit ill upon him, "and I ask Miss Vale to serve as curator. Her loyalty to my uncle's memory and her knowledge of his methods will ensure the foundation serves truth rather than mere acquisition." Margaret Vale accepted the position with quiet dignity, her dedication to her murdered employer's legacy undiminished by trauma. Mrs. Hartwell, the faithful housekeeper, watched these arrangements with approval, her weathered hands already returning to the domestic order that had been so violently disrupted. The philosophical dimension. As the morning light strengthened across the Yorkshire countryside, Poirot stood alone in the death-marked library, contemplating the crystal paperweight he had adjusted to perfect geometric alignment with the desk's edge. The room felt different now, not merely cleansed of violence, but somehow purified by the revelation of truth. "The human heart," he murmured to the empty space where Ashcroft had died, "it is indeed a complex engine. It desires beauty, truth, recognition, but when twisted by envy, by desperation, by the arrogance of believing oneself above common morality, then even the greatest gifts become instruments of destruction. He picked up one of Pemberton's discarded artist's brushes, turning it over in his gloved fingers. Dr. Pemberton possessed the precision of the surgeon, the eye of the artist, the intellect to deceive with brilliant sophistication. Yet it was the very brilliance, the obsession with perfection, that provided his fatal flaw. He could not tolerate chaos, not in his art, not in his crime. He arranged the mounting tacks by size, calculated the laudanum dosage with surgical precision, timed his movements by the household's peculiarities. But order imposed upon murder leaves patterns that the little gray cells cannot ignore. The restoration of integrity. The Caravaggio forgery would find its way to the National Gallery's collection of famous frauds, a testament to Pemberton's perverse genius and the tragedy it had wrought. Whitmore Hall, divested of its most infamous masterpiece, began its transformation into a genuine center for scholarship and authenticated works. The house that had held its breath for 3 days of deception could finally exhale in the service of truth. Inspector Hartwell, preparing his final report on one of the most sophisticated art fraud cases in British criminal history, found himself reflecting on the Belgian detective's methods. "Tell me, Mr. Poirot," he said as they prepared to leave the library, "what was the first small thing that told you the doctor was our man?" Poirot's eyes twinkled with satisfaction. "The mounting tacks, mon ami, arranged by size like surgical instruments on a medical tray. And the scent, clove oil and camphor, that belonged less to a lady's expensive candles than to a physician's consulting room. After that, it was merely a matter of understanding the psychology that demanded such precision even in the commission of murder." Outro, as Poirot's car rolled away down the gravel drive, Whitmore Hall settled into its new chapter, no longer a stage for deception and violence, but a monument to the triumph of truth over even the most sophisticated lies. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall, corrected at Poirot's insistence to show the proper time, chimed the hour with honest precision. "There is no perfect crime," Poirot reflected to Inspector Hartwell as the ancient manor disappeared behind them, "as there is no perfect forgery. Both require the cooperation of too many human elements, clocks, servants, the small habits that betray the heart's true nature. In the end, it is always the psychology that reveals itself. The hand may lie with consummate skill, but the soul cannot help but leave its signature upon the work." He adjusted his tie to perfect alignment with his waistcoat buttons, a small gesture that spoke to his own need for order, but order in service of justice, not deception. In art, as in crime, the frame must be worthy of the picture. When it is not, the little gray cells will set it straight. The case was closed, the mystery solved, and Hercule Poirot was ready to return to London, where other challenges awaited the attention of the world's greatest detective. But the memory of Whitmore Hall, with its lessons about genius corrupted and ultimately redeemed through the methodical pursuit of truth, would remain with him always, another chapter in the endless book of human nature that he had spent his life learning to read. Justice had been served not through vengeance, but through the restoration of moral order to a world temporarily disrupted by criminal brilliance. The little gray cells had done their work, and truth, as always, had proven more enduring than even the most masterful deception. Dawn came clean and cold to Whitmore Hall, as if the very frost wished to scour away the disorder of the last days. The ancient Yorkshire manor exhaled at last, its stones settling into a quieter rhythm after 3 days of violence and deception. The metallic click of handcuffs had echoed with chilling finality through the drawing-room as Dr. Geoffrey Pemberton was led away, his distinguished bearing reduced to the hollow shell of a man whose carefully constructed world had collapsed beneath the weight of exposure. The swift hand of justice. Inspector Hartwell returned before 9, his practical Yorkshire sensibilities carrying the grim satisfaction of closure. "We have it all, Mr. Poirot," he announced in the library where the Belgian detective awaited with characteristic composure. "The scope is staggering. 23 forgeries over 15 years, works attributed to everyone from Vermeer to Turner, sold through a network of continental dealers who asked no inconvenient questions." From sealed evidence bags, he withdrew the recovered materials that painted a picture of systematic fraud. Bank drafts totaling more than £100,000, correspondence with auction houses across Europe, detailed technical notes on aging processes, and photographic plates showing the X-ray analyses and ultraviolet studies that Pemberton had used to create deceptions sophisticated enough to fool the very experts who employed those authentication techniques. The legal proceedings that followed moved with English efficiency. Pemberton's confession, delivered with the chilling detachment of a man who viewed his crimes as intellectual exercises, detailed years of sophisticated fraud designed to maintain his lifestyle while his medical practice declined. Margaret Vale's testimony proved particularly damning. Her clear, precise account of Pemberton's visit and his ominous words about the Caravaggio, making history, but not as expected, solidified the motive beyond doubt. The Continental authorities expressed keen interest, as several major auction houses had unknowingly sold Pemberton's forgeries for years. The financial implications ran into hundreds of thousands of pounds, affecting collectors from London to Paris to New York. Pemberton faced not merely charges of murder and attempted murder, but fraud on an international scale that had damaged confidence in the art market itself. The transformation of character. The ordeal had wrought profound changes in those who survived it. Timothy Ashcroft stood by the library windows with a decisiveness that would have astonished those who had known him as weak and dissolute. The frivolous, debt-ridden young man had been transformed by tragedy into something approaching nobility of purpose. Uncle Vivian's passion for beauty was genuine, he declared to Poirot, his voice carrying newfound conviction. He was betrayed by someone he considered a friend, and that betrayal led to his death. His legacy must not be defined by this fraud, but by his dedication to authentic beauty. With remarkable resolution, Timothy announced his intention to sell the entire Ashcroft collection, not for personal gain, but to establish the Vivian Ashcroft Foundation for Art Authentication. Its mission would encompass cutting-edge research into forensic art analysis, education for collectors, and the exposure of fraud wherever it lay hidden. The proceeds would fund sophisticated equipment, scholarships for promising researchers, and a permanent exhibition warning of the dangers of sophisticated deception. Lady Constance Fairfax, her aristocratic bearing intact despite the ordeal of suspicion she had endured, offered her considerable influence to support Timothy's endeavors. "A most commendable transformation, young man," she said with characteristic crispness, though her voice carried genuine warmth. "Vivian would have approved, and perhaps in time it will restore some integrity to a market that has become far too susceptible to clever charlatans." Margaret Vale accepted the position of the Foundation's first director with quiet dignity, her dedication to her murdered employer's memory undiminished by trauma. Her meticulous nature, intimate knowledge of Ashcroft's methods, and first-hand experience of sophisticated deception made her the ideal steward of his reformed legacy. Mrs. Hartwell, the faithful housekeeper whose discovery of the locked door had been crucial to the case, watched these arrangements with approval. Her weathered hands were already returning to the domestic order that had been so violently disrupted, but now in service of scholarship rather than private collection. The international ramifications. As news of the Pemberton case spread through art circles, the reverberations were felt across the continent. A French dealer resigned in disgrace. A Viennese intermediary vanished entirely. 2 major auction houses commenced internal inquiries, their catalogues suddenly suspect. Insurance companies arrived with grave faces and notebooks that fattened by the hour, calculating losses that would reshape the industry's approach to authentication. The forged Caravaggio itself would find its way to the National Gallery's collection of famous frauds, a permanent testament to Pemberton's perverse genius and the tragedy it had wrought. Whitmore Hall, divested of its most infamous masterpiece, began its transformation into a genuine center for scholarship and authenticated works. Poirot's philosophical reflections. As the morning light strengthened across the Yorkshire countryside, Poirot stood alone in the death-marked library, contemplating the crystal paperweight he had adjusted to perfect geometric alignment with the desk's edge. The room felt different now, not merely cleansed of violence, but somehow purified by the revelation of truth. "The human heart," he murmured to the empty space where Ashcroft had died. "It is indeed a complex engine. It desires beauty, truth, recognition. But when twisted by envy, by desperation, by the arrogance of believing oneself above common morality, then even the greatest gifts become instruments of destruction." He picked up one of Pemberton's discarded artist's brushes, turning it over in his gloved fingers. Dr. Pemberton possessed the precision of the surgeon, the eye of the artist, the intellect to deceive with brilliant sophistication. Yet it was the very brilliance, the obsession with perfection, that provided his fatal flaw. He could not tolerate chaos, not in his art, not in his crime. But order imposed upon murder leaves patterns that the little grey cells cannot ignore. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall, corrected at Poirot's insistence to show the proper time, chimed the hour with honest precision. The house that had held its breath for 3 days of deception could finally exhale in the service of truth. The restoration of moral order. Inspector Hartwell, preparing his final report on one of the most sophisticated art fraud cases in British criminal history, found himself reflecting on the Belgian detective's methods. "Tell me, Mr. Poirot," he said as they prepared to leave the library, "what was the first small thing that told you the doctor was our man?" Poirot's eyes twinkled with satisfaction. "The mounting tax, mon ami, arranged by size like surgical instruments on a medical tray, and the scent, clove oil and camphor, that belonged less to a lady's expensive candles than to a physician's consulting room. After that, it was merely a matter of understanding the psychology that demanded such precision, even in the commission of murder." The final departure. As Poirot's car rolled away down the gravel drive, Whitmore Hall settled into its new chapter, no longer a stage for deception and violence, but a monument to the triumph of truth over even the most sophisticated lies. The ancient manor had found its proper purpose, not as a private treasure house, but as a beacon of integrity in a world too often seduced by brilliant counterfeits. "There is no perfect crime," Poirot reflected to Inspector Hartwell as the manor disappeared behind them, "as there is no perfect forgery. Both require the cooperation of too many human elements. Psychology, habit, the small details that betray the heart's true nature. In the end, it is always the soul that reveals itself, leaving its signature upon the work, whether that work be art or murder." He adjusted his tie to perfect alignment with his waistcoat buttons, a small gesture that spoke to his own need for order, but order in service of justice, not deception. In art, as in crime, the frame must be worthy of the picture. When it is not, when genius serves deception rather than truth, when friendship yields to greed and reputation to murder, then the little grey cells must set it straight. The case was closed, the mystery solved, and Hercule Poirot was ready to return to London, where other challenges awaited the attention of the world's greatest detective. But the memory of Whitmore Hall, with its lessons about genius, corrupted and ultimately redeemed through the methodical pursuit of truth, would remain with him always, another chapter in the endless book of human nature that he had spent his life learning to read. Justice had been served not through vengeance, but through the restoration of moral order to a world temporarily disrupted by criminal brilliance. The little grey cells had done their work, and truth, as always, had proven more enduring than even the most masterful deception. Epilogue. The enduring legacy. 6 months later, the Ashcroft Foundation had become a model for art authentication worldwide. Scholars from across Europe and America came to study its innovative techniques, while the notoriety of the Pemberton case had paradoxically enhanced its credibility. Here was an institution born from the ashes of sophisticated fraud, dedicated to ensuring that such deception could never again claim innocent lives. Dr. Jeffrey Pemberton, serving his life sentence in Pentonville Prison, had been commissioned by the authorities to create educational materials about art forgery. His criminal expertise transformed into a tool for law enforcement training. Even in disgrace, his artistic genius could not be entirely suppressed, though it now served truth rather than deception. The grandfather clock in Whitmore Hall's entrance hall chimed the hours with honest precision, neither late nor early, its corrected time a symbol of the moral order that had been restored to the ancient manor. And somewhere in London, Hercule Poirot prepared for his next case, secure in the knowledge that no amount of sophistication could overcome the relentless pursuit of justice, and that truth, however temporarily buried, would always find its way to the surface through the methodical work of the little grey cells.